Welcome back to another edition of Components Breakdown. Today we're going to take a look at a very small portion of a much larger and developed world known as Earth Reborn. Earth Reborn is a 2 to 4 player, scenario-driven, miniature-style war game that takes players about an hour to complete. The backstory of this universe involves the arrival of two opposing factions that emerged from the wreckage of an all-out nuclear disaster. Now, the two factions in the game include the militaristic NORAD, which were born out of a U.S. government operations team, and the occultist Salemites, who consist of the privileged Commonwealth survivors. Let's go ahead and take a closer look inside the game. The first thing I wanted to mention is that Earth Reborn ships in a very large box. Now, these are typically known in this industry as big box games, and the reason why they're called big box games is for the fact that they take up a very large portion or footprint in one's collection, and Earth Reborn is no exception to that rule. Now, between my friend and I, we have 2 copies of the game, and we have kept my copy perfectly intact, and the reason for that is we wanted to show you a couple different things about the game when you initially purchase it. One of those things being that the box lid does not fit perfectly down as you see here, and there is about a 1-inch gap from the top of the box to the bottom of the box. And the reason for that is there are 8 very large cardboard sheets in here that contain all the different components that will be used. So let's go ahead and open up the box lid and take a closer look inside. We're going to take a closer look at all the components inside so that everyone interested in Earth Reborn is 100% fully aware of what they are getting themselves into prior to purchasing the game. Now, the first time that I opened the box and looked at the included rulebook, I was instantly shocked at just how much of a time commitment would be required to not only learn this massive rule set, but how hard it might be to teach players as well. And the reason for this is that the game includes a 44-page rulebook that is just littered with text and icons, as well as 50 pictured examples of gameplay. So potential buyers are going to have to seriously ask themselves not only if they have the patience to read and digest all these rules, but also whether or not they have the gaming partners available to them who are willing to invest a lengthy set of time to learn them as well. So this is most definitely not a product for the casual gamers or to introduce to family members during the holidays. Now, that's not to say it can't be enjoyed by either of those demographics, but it's an investment of time that should not be taken lightly. Now, the wonderful thing about Earth Reborn, though, is that it offers 9 scenarios in the base game, and each of these scenarios builds upon the rules with each new chapter that you play. Hence, the system itself is built very much like a tutorial, with the game introducing you only to the core rules and mechanics, and gradually offering about 1 to 3 new rules with each new scenario that you play. It's really a wonderful way of slowly getting players' feet wet as they progress into the game's deeper mechanics. Now, players, if they wish, most certainly may jump right in and start playing with everything that the game has to offer, but it's probably not something I would suggest, especially if you're teaching it to someone who hasn't read through the rules themselves. So take it slowly and learn the rules as you go. It's the easiest way to play Earth Reborn. Now, as I previously mentioned, the box lid does not initially fit all the way down. This is due to the massive 8 cardboard sheets full of room tokens, doorway tokens, and other components that will have to be punched and separated, and then laid out in this well-designed insert that you see here below. Now, everything included in the game will fit back in the game box without the need for any outside storage components, which is a welcome relief for people like myself who use Plano boxes. Now, as I mentioned, this is a copy of my game, so everything you see here is how the game initially shipped. Now, I've mentally labored for some time trying to figure out the best way in which to give viewers just a very basic idea of how Earth Reborn's mechanics and gameplay function. And I kept coming back to the realization that A, there's simply too much information to categorically break down, and B, nobody is going to want to watch a 2-hour, 8-part video for a game that they may not even be interested in after watching just the first few minutes of this review. So what I've decided to do is to just concentrate on the core and most basic functions of the game by introducing them in the same manner by which they are introduced in the game's tutorial system, and that system being primarily the scenarios in the game. So for the rest of this video, I will be gearing my discussions more towards the game's turn structure and the actions that the players can perform, and less on the actual step-by-step gameplay mechanics that most of my viewers are accustomed to. So at the start of the game, players will spend some time choosing a scenario and then building the map to the specifications of that given scenario, making sure to place all the proper door and terrain structures onto the map. Players will then decide who will play which of the two available factions in the game, and then follow that up by placing one of the player screens in front of them. Next, players will find the appropriate character and equipment cards for each of the members and play as specified again by that particular scenario, making sure to place their double-sided character cards on their healthy sides. Players will then position their matching miniatures onto the map, again according to the scenario in which they are playing. Now, all of the 48 order tiles are going to be placed in the cloth bag so they can be drawn randomly through the course of the game. Finally, all of the double-sided command point and wound counters will be placed in a common bank to the side of the play area. Let's go ahead and take a look into scenario number 1. Scenario number 1 will introduce players to the most basic of Earth Reborn's core rules, with simple gameplay mechanics including the game's 3-part turn sequence, as well as character movement and close combat. Now, before we get into any of these basic rules, let me first give you a very brief overview of some of the game's most utilized components. All players will begin with a set number of double-sided character cards representing the personnel that they will be using for that specific scenario. The character cards have two sides to them, which represent both the healthy and wounded abilities of that character. These cards are just littered with icons and numbers representing a multitude of characteristics that are unique to that specific character. However, only some of these icons will be needed in the initial scenarios of the game, with others being introduced gradually as gamers progress further into the scenarios. Now, character cards hold key important information like players' life points, their armor values, their movement values, their close combat charts, shooting values, and even the weight allowances, which dictates how much equipment that they can carry. Now, as chaotic as all this initially appears to players, everything on not only these cards, but all the other components in the game are organized in such a way that it quickly becomes very intuitive to reference just about everything on these cards through these simple icons that are systematically used pretty much throughout the entire game. So it becomes very intuitive and very easy. The second component that needs mentioning are the order tiles. Players will give orders to their characters by assigning these order tiles to their character cards and spending command points to execute those orders. An order tile always contains multiple orders which are divided into 4 different sections that represent the different order types that can be used together to perform complex actions or simply by themselves to perform a singular action. The 5 orders available to players are move, close combat, shoot, search, and interact. Now, the number on each section indicates the maximum number of command points that a player can spend on that section of the order tile. Now, the unique thing about order tiles is that they are all different from one another in the game, so players will have to utilize these tiles, or the tiles that are dealt to them, to the best of their abilities in order to perform the correct combinations of actions that they desire each turn. The third component I'm going to discuss briefly are the miniatures. Now, each of the miniatures has 2 color-coded circles around their bases, which represent 2 different gameplay abilities. The inner circles arcs represent the character's strength in close combat and can change depending upon whether that character is attacking or defending an enemy who is in front of them, to their sides, or even behind them. Likewise, miniatures also have an outer circle that works in a very similar fashion, except that it is used only for ranged combat. Now, each of these color-coded arcs will represent the number of dice that a player will roll in either one of these 2 types of combat, with close combat values being represented on the appropriate player's character cards, and ranged values being represented on the weapons that those characters carry. So essentially, each character's inherent strengths and weaknesses are very apparent right from the start of the game, but most certainly can be modified by the equipment and the weapons that they carry. The last component I'm going to show here are the combat dice. Earth Reborn is a game of constant combat where everything is determined by the roll of the dice in the game. Now, not only is combat determined by dice, but so are numerous other gameplay mechanics such as interacting with objects, or searching, or initiating a player's special abilities. So there is most definitely some degree of luck already built into the game. However, most rolls can be mitigated through strategic planning as well as proper use of your command points and order tiles in the game. So players most certainly can change their luck depending upon their ability to manipulate the board in the best way that they can. Scenario number 1 will introduce players to a couple key mechanics in the game. First is the game's turn structure, which can actually be specified or altered by a given scenario, but the basic way in which it is played are through 3 distinct phases in the game: the initiative phase, the action phase, and the final phase. Now, during the initiative phase of the game, each player will randomly draw out 5 order tiles from the cloth bag and place them behind their player screen. These tiles will represent their team's available orders for the entire turn. Players will also draw an X number of command points from the common bank, which again are specified by the given scenario. Players may also earn bonus command points at this time for some of their characters they control, according to the bonus command point icons on their character cards. Again, these counters will be placed behind their player screen to be kept secret. The starting player will then be given the initiative token, allowing them to activate one of their characters first in the game. Once again, this again is determined by the scenario. Next comes the activation phase, and there are a lot of different things that take place in this phase, but in a nutshell, the activation phase consists of a series of different rounds in which each player in turn typically plays an order from behind their player screen and applies it to one of their character cards. And they'll spend command points to enact any one of those orders on the tiles that can be used. Now, assigning orders to characters allows them to do such things as moving across the map, interacting with objects on the map, or initiating combat with enemy characters. Since most order tiles have numbers greater than 1 attached to them on one of the 4 specific regions on the tile, players can spend command points up to that allotted value on the order tile to enact some actions more than once, such as moving a character, or they can use them to add extra combat dice to an initiated combat roll. Now, each character in the game has what is known as a command point constraint, which is really just an easier way of saying that each character has a maximum number of total command points that can be spent on him and her for the entire turn. So you can't spend or can't keep piling up orders onto a character who has reached their maximum allotted value. Once all players have either passed due to either running out of order tiles to use or spending all of their command points for that turn, players will then pass and proceed to the final phase. Now, it is in this final phase where players will check for any victory conditions to see if they've been met, and then begin to clean up their player area by removing old order tiles from the board and placing used command points back into the common bank, as well as perform any other conditions that may have happened in the game, such as removing time counters from the board. Scenario number 1 also introduces us to 2 of the most basic types of actions in the game: movement and close combat, both of which are integral to controlling key spots of the map. Movement is initiated by performing the movement order of an order tile and assigning command points up to its maximum value. For every command point spent on a movement order will allow that character to gain as many movement points as indicated by the movement value on his character card. So, a character with a movement value or a beginning movement value of 6 would be able to move 12 spaces if a movement order was initiated with 2 command points. Close combat, on the other hand, their orders can be used to attack adjacent enemy characters or to destroy terrain in the game. Now, to initiate close combat, players must spend at least 1 command point on close combat order section of a tile that is assigned to one of their characters. Both players involved in close combat, being both the attacker and the defender, will then have to determine those characters' combat strengths by looking at both the facing of their miniatures and their correlating arc value colors, as well as the matching sections of their character cards. Players will then roll a set number of dice according to the numbers shown on their character cards. Now, this can and will be modified in later scenarios to the use of weapons such as knives in the game. The attacker will essentially have to roll more hits on his combination of dice than the combinations of his opponent's dice and armor values added together to be able to damage the opponent. Now, this may seem very difficult at first, but by spending extra command points on an order tile will allow attackers the ability to roll additional dice in battles, as well as the ability to inflict automatic hits with critical rolls of the dice. I know it's very complicated here at first, but it's actually very intuitive once you understand the system. Now, there are a lot more rules associated with all of these actions that I just mentioned, including turn structure, movement, and close combat. But what I've given to you at this point is just the brass tacks overview of what is essentially the most basic rules that are needed to pick up and play the game immediately. Scenario number 2 will introduce players to 2 more sets of mechanics in the game: line of sight and dueling. Line of sight is exactly as it says and is used for later mechanics in the game such as shooting and dueling. Now, for those who are unaware though, line of sight refers to an imaginary line of visibility that must exist between 2 spots in a map where both spots can visibly see one another. Now, in Earth Reborn, the line of sight is only established if there are no obstacles between 2 squares on the map, such as a door, a tree, or even another character. No line of sight icons are used throughout the game's components to signify areas that block line of sight, which is a great benefit to the players. Now, the second mechanic introduced in scenario number 2 is dueling. Players can duel one another in an attempt to steal the initiative away from one another, which can better be described as simply interrupting another player's actions. Now, there are 2 types of duels in the game, both of which are fought in the exact same way. The first is dueling for initiative in the game. Now, as I previously stated, the game's scenarios will dictate which faction will go first during each turn of the game. However, players can duel to take that initiative away from one another. Second, players may duel to interrupt other players' actions if they are in their line of sight. Winning a duel in this manner may allow players to initiate close combat first or shoot one of their weapons before another player can act. Now, the actual action of dueling is very simple and involves each player secretly bidding an X number of their available command points from behind their player screens, placing them in their hand and revealing them at the same time. The player who bids the highest will win the duel and get whatever award is associated with it. Either way, both players will place all of the command points that were bid back into the common bank. So as you can see, dueling is most definitely a great way of gaining the initiative on the map, but may come at a high cost in command points, severely limiting your orders for the rest of that turn. What I wanted to leave the viewers with at this point are my thoughts and opinions thus far with the game. Now, I've played Earth Reborn with all the mechanics that I've introduced up to this point, as well as those included in several additional scenarios of the game, including equipment, shooting, the iconographic phasing system at the bottom of each of the player's character cards, interact orders, morale points, searching, as well as utilizing character special abilities. Even now, though, I still have more to learn about the game, including what most believe to be its most important feature, which is called SAGs, or Scenario Auto-Generating System, giving the game near indefinite replayability. Now, Earth Reborn passes itself off as a 2 to 4 player game, and that's fine, but in my experience with similar style games, it most definitely is best delivered as a one-on-one experience. It's kind of like shoehorning a 3rd and 4th player into War of the Ring. Yes, it can be done, but let's be honest, it's not exactly the model for multiplayer war games. What it does do so well, though, is deliver on its initial promise of creating a universe that is soaked in themes so rich that you'd think you were playing an established game like Space Hulk. The rules are incredibly streamlined, so well explained in the rulebook, and so intuitive that once you learn the simple graphical language of the game, you'll marvel at just how much depth they were able to include in all the game's components without the use of almost any text in the entire game. This is most definitely a game for the board game enthusiasts out there who revel in deep, strategic, tactical war games, but also enjoy a speck of luck thrown into the mix. There are a lot of rules in this game, so buyers are going to have to seriously ask themselves if this is truly something that they're willing to devote quality time into. and the game doesn't truly distinguish itself from any other game on the market until most all the mechanics are fully introduced to the players. But for those who take that amount of time to fully implement everything that Earth Reborn has to offer, are going to find themselves in love with not only the rich theme of the game, but they're going to have a much deeper appreciation of just how remarkably well designed this game is. That is Earth Reborn, and I am Jeremy Salinas, and thank you very much for watching.